The U.S. Supreme Court hears oral arguments today in a case which raises questions about religious freedom and separation of church and state. The case, Carson versus Makin, involves school choice in the state of Maine, which is tied to state-funded tuition aid in settings where public schools are not available. The key question is whether families who receive state vouchers can apply them to private religious schools for their children. And joining me now is Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUSblog. Amy, welcome back. Great to see you as always. I'd like to get your thoughts on how things went today at the Supreme Court and what stood out to you.
So what stood out was that it didn't seem to be a particularly close case. Sometimes you come out of these and you're not quite sure how it's going to go, but all 6 of the court's conservative justices, to me, seemed poised to strike down the law. There seemed to be a perception that this law discriminated against religious families and religious schools. Back in 2020, the Supreme Court had ruled that states don't have to provide public funding for private schools. If they do, that they can't discriminate against schools just because they're religious. They left open the question of whether or not they had to provide public funding to schools that are going to use the money to teach religion, which was the question in this case. And it seemed that the justices didn't really see any difference between schools that are religious and schools that teach their faith, as some of the justices said.
Yeah, and Justice Barrett said that the law requires schools are non-sectarian, but doesn't seem to have any oversight in place regarding the public schools and what they are teaching. You kind of mentioned that. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe how important that line of questioning was?
Yeah, so the Maine's argument was that this was really kind of a very unusual system, and it is an unusual system. And Maine had defended the law, saying that what we're doing, Maine is a rural state. Some parts are very sparsely populated. And so some school districts don't provide a public school, particularly at the secondary level, and instead they contract out or they provide vouchers for families to attend another public school or a private school of their choice. But they say you can't use it to attend a sectarian school because it's not the rough equivalent of a public education. They say we're just trying to ensure that the students get the same education that they would if they were in public school. And that really didn't fly with the justices for a variety of reasons. The justices were skeptical about what that meant to get a public education. Justice Clarence Thomas said, wouldn't the public education not be concerned with religion, but with academic interests? But it really all came down to, for most justices, to the idea that this discriminated against religion and against religious schools, that there's really not a distinction between whether or not a school is religious and whether or not it teaches religion. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, talked about 2 schools. He said, one that doesn't have as part of its faith the idea of teaching students about religion, and one that does. And if the second school can't get public funds under a program like Maine, you're really just punishing it for its beliefs, he said. You're discriminating based on beliefs. And so there's really not a distinction between religious status and religious use.
Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot of time left, but I'm curious, prior to 1980, families in Maine did have the option to use state-funded tuition money to send their children to faith-based schools. What changed, ultimately leading to this current case in the Supreme Court?
So there was an opinion by Maine's Attorney General that providing funding for parents to send their kids to religious schools would itself violate the Constitution, the Constitution's Establishment Clause. And so that was the change.
Okay. All right. Well, Amy, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your analysis as always.
Thanks for having me.